Hello, everybody.
Hi.
I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Sure, you're going to find this to be a fascinating subject. I'd like to take the moment to introduce the foremost expert on the Harvest Moon, a gentleman who's the president of Blanca Airfield, who's a very interest in this subject. And well, without further ado, my dad, Elliott Smith.
Thank you, Wesley, and thank you for this wonderful crowd that we have here. Thank you for coming. As Wesley says, my name is Elliott Smith, and I'm president of Friends of Blanca Airfield. And also, I am I guess you'd say, the president of the Harvest Moon Historical Society. And interesting enough, most of the members of the society are here right now. In any event, growing up, I kind of always knew a little bit about the Harvest Moon. My great-grandfather was an engineering officer on board the ship during the Civil War. Actually, I remember that we always had his sword in the house. I never quite knew what my great-grandfather did or really what the Harvest Moon was, but his sword, which I have over there now, is inscribed on the brass end of it.
Show and tell.
Yeah.
I used to teach.
There's an inscription on there that he put on saying that he had that on board the steamer Harvest Moon when it sank in the down in South Carolina. Actually, about the only thing that I knew about the sword, really, other than that, was that it was used in a number of weddings in the family to cut the cake. We used it, and I guess my sons did, and so on. When my aunt died, she was in her 90s, we came across a series of letters. One of the letters that was written by my great-grandfather talks about being on the ship Harvest Moon when it ran onto a Confederate torpedo or mine and sank. The letter was quite fascinating and made me wonder a little bit more about what was the Harvest Moon. I happened to be out in San Francisco and in a marine bookstore there, and came across a book on Civil War ships. And I came across this picture of the Harvest Moon. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. I've always been interested myself in making model ships. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to make a model of this ship. Of course, the question is, where do you get the plans from? And so that started me on a quest for information on the Harvest Moon. This goes back to about the 1990s when I started. And it's been quite an interesting journey. As I say, this was one of the first pictures that I came across, but there were others. On a visit down to the Maritime Museum down by Newport News, in their library there, I came across a photograph of the Harvest Moon. And this was taken down in Portland, and the picture was taken in 1862, which is really pretty early in the art of photography. But that's the only photograph that I ever did find of the Harvest Moon. And of course, information on that drawing indicated that it was Lawrence in Portland, Maine, and built by Joseph Dahlgren. owned by a shipping firm called Spear, Lang, and Delano. At this point, I also did a lot of traveling to different maritime museums and shipyards. The ship itself being built in Portland. Why we visited Portland, and the shipyard is no longer there. It's been replaced by the terminal, shipping terminal. But the company that provided the engine, their building still stood. A little bit of the specs on it. They say it was built by Joseph N. Dyer in Portland, Maine. He didn't build too many ships. The only information I could find is that he built at least one other steamboat. How long that company lasted, I have no idea, but at least he built the Harvest Moon. It's a wooden ship, about 200 feet long, relatively fast. It had side paddle wheels, and of course a vertical beam engine, or also known as a walking beam engine. Kind of a monstrous type engine. The one that they had on the Harvest Moon, according to the papers at this Portland company, was salvaged from a ship sunk in China waters, and then rebuilt by the Portland company, and for the Harvest Moon. In 1862, there was a marine painter, artist by the name of Fitzhugh Lane. And he was quite well known at that time, and he made beautiful paintings of ships, sailing ships, and steamboats, and whatever. On a visit that we made to Gloucester, Massachusetts, to the Cape Ann Historical Society, who collected who had all the papers of Lane, as well as a lot of his pictures. They had a photograph of the Harvest Moon, which obviously is the same one that I had found down there in Virginia. But this one was marked up by the artist. As you can see on there, he's got grid lines, X and Y. And there are some notes on the drawing itself. In other words, he has a note on there that this was a commission for the ship owner, and also that the picture was taken in Portland. Now, according to the people at the Cape May Historical Society, he never painted a picture of the Harvest Moon, and that the Harvest Moon was purchased by the Navy for use in the blockade before the artist ever got to paint the picture. But on one of our visits to the Steamship Society Museum or library down in Portland, down in Baltimore, Maryland, in their files, they had a photograph of a painting, which is the one on the right there. This is a partial photograph. The actual painting was larger, and it doesn't have any artist's signature on it. In the lower right-hand corner, there is an inscription that says, courtesy of, what's his name?
Courier.
Courier, right. Courtesy of Myron Courier, which in our research and visits to different towns and Massachusetts determined that he was a photographer who, back in the 30s and 40s, who took lots of pictures. He's no longer living. We did find a cousin, but nobody could shed any light as to where he took that picture of the Harvest Moon. In any event, we went back to the Cape Ann Historical Society and said, well, look it, we have this photograph of the Harvest Moon. And they looked at it and they say, well, it certainly looks like his style of painting. And, but they just didn't know where it was, or they never even thought that he made that painting. We have searched as hard as we can, and we have never found any place where that painting could be. But maybe someday it'll turn up. Actually, this Fitzhugh Lane's paintings are well into the high six figures anymore. So it'd be quite valuable. In any event, being intrigued by that picture of the Harvest Moon, we took another one of Lane's paintings. This one happened to be of a sailing ship in Portland Harbor. And thanks to Photoshop, we replaced the sailboat with the Harvest Moon. And the interesting thing about this picture is, if you notice, there's a little rowboat in the lower right-hand corner, and going back to the, maybe hard to see, but it's also a rowboat, people following the oars in the lower right-hand corner of this one. So kind of a clue, the pictures were very, very similar. In any event, we kind of put it together, and with the help of, I guess it's the Chinese artists, they duplicated it, and they did a quite nice job of it. So we have a 26 by 38 oil on canvas above our fireplace of the Harvest Moon. After the Harvest Moon was built, it was actually built to carry passengers between Bangor and Portland along the Kennebec River. And it did so for a good portion of 1863. The brochure on the left there was from a newspaper in 1863, telling about their service from Portland to Bangor. And equally interesting, if not more so, is about 2 months ago, I got an email from a woman who lives in Massachusetts, near the Kennebec. She says she's restoring an 1850s home that she recently bought, and when they took the wall down, behind the wall, she found those two tickets just kind of laying behind the wall. And they're both for the Harvest Moon, 1863, Portland to Hallowell, which is a little town on the Kennebec, and the other one is Portland to Gardner. Gardner is also a little town right there. Why? No. Why they were just kind of laying behind the wall, who knows? But it's kind of a remarkable find, you know. Yeah. Anyway, towards the end of 1863, the U.S. Navy bought the ship, and they needed, they were buying anything that floated to use in the blockade along the East Coast and Gulf Coast. So they bought the Harvest Moon and sent it to Boston Navy Yard. And there it was commissioned in 1863 and assigned to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron as Admiral Dahlgren's flagship. Now, Admiral Dahlgren at the time was the commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And he was formerly the commander of the Washington Navy Yard. And he was pretty much an expert on armament. And through his actions, they developed several guns for naval guns, which they actually named after him, Dahlgren, and so on. That was quite successful. When he was, in order to be appointed to command the Washington Navy Yard, they had to promote him from lieutenant to captain, which they did. And he was a good friend of President Lincoln. And subsequently, they made him an admiral so he could take over the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron originally was under the command of Samuel Francis DuPont. And he was down there, had the blockade running, and everything's fine, except people were very impatient about Charleston, because Charleston was the hub of the Confederacy. So they wanted DuPont to take Charleston. And he said, I really don't think we can do it with the ships that we have, and it's just not possible. And so he postponed any such action for quite a while, until finally he got a direct order, go in there and take Charleston. Well, he tried, never got in. He turned around. They had maybe a half a dozen monitors, but one of them was sunk. They were all damaged. One of the problems with the monitors is that they were very slow and they didn't have much armament. So, because he failed to take Charleston, they returned him to Washington and appointed Dahlgren to take over. This is another painting of the Harvest Moon that we found on the wall of the Harvest Moon ice cream parlor down in Georgetown, South Carolina. And it's a rather large mural that was nicely done. Obviously, they used that photograph of the ship that we saw earlier as a model, but it's nicely done. And incidentally, all of this information on the ships, and the drawings and the pictures, allowed me to start making drawings for a model of the Harvest Moon. So in any event, the blockade of the South was broken down into the North Blockading Squadron, the South Atlantic Blockade Squadron, which is the one that we're talking about, and then a couple of squadrons in the Gulf. The South Atlantic Blockade Squadron actually extended from the tip of North Carolina down to the tip of Florida. And I guess you can't see too much about on these drawings, but kind of shows that the disposition of the ships. It's a fairly long coast, and the blockading squadron only had 75 ships, plus or minus. A lot of them were just small gunboats, and it was a difficult thing to control. Although they did a pretty good job. In most cases, obviously the main channel was into Charleston, but Georgetown, which is further north, also was kind of a haven for the smugglers. The Harvest Moon was assigned as the Admiral's flagship. And he liked the Harvest Moon because it was fast. It could make like 15 knots. Plus it could go into these narrow rivers and inlets and bays because it drew very little water. He had another ship that when he was in port, he would move to a ship called the Philadelphia, which was a little bit bigger and a little bit more comfortable. But if he had a place to go, why, he took the Harvest Moon. And he usually came on board with his staff and also a troop of Marines. And the Harvest Moon, when it was not running dispatches for the Admiral, or taking the Admiral someplace, it would just be assigned to blockading duty. Although it never intercepted a smuggler. So, and apparently the blockading duty was very boring, especially in the hot summer weather down there. You're just sitting out there in the bay 24 hours a day. The first captain of the Harvest Moon was a fellow by the name of Joshua P. Warren. And he had supposedly he went to sea when he was just a youngster, like 13 years old, and worked on ships the rest of his life. He was kind of a strange guy. In the 1890s, like 30 years after the end of the war, he wrote a journal telling about his adventures during the Civil War. And when you read it, which is right now that journal is down at the Washington Navy Yard, and when you read it, you find that he never made a mistake. Everybody loved him, and the ship was was able to get going whenever the Admiral says go, he went. In reading the logbook, things are a little bit different. And it turns out that if you read some of the journals of the officers that worked under him, why, they really didn't think too much of him. There was one interesting episode which kind of reminded me of Captain Creed and the missing cherries, where apparently one of the Marines was missing $60. So he personally kind of interviewed each of the sailors, and they had already found the $60 in one of the sailors' I guess, belongings, so he knew who the culprit probably was. But he took the opportunity to talk to every crewman on there, give him the third degree, you know, including the fellow that actually stole it. Very kind of strange. And the other thing about Warren, too, before he took command of the Harvest Moon, he was in command of a ship called the Daylight. And he was very successful with that ship in the blockade. So he had captured a number of ships, and of course, as a captain, they made a lot of money off the sale of these ships. But he apparently was visiting a captain of another ship who happened to be a friend of his, and according to some letters and some other action, I can get the terms that were used here. He alleged a violation of an 11-year-old daughter of his friend, so, and fellow officer. In other words, there was something that went on right there that wasn't very, very officer-like. Although there was some talk about having him court-martialed, as far as can be determined from looking at records, he never was. Apparently, he left town and ultimately was given command of the Harvest Moon. There is recently a book written about not about Warren, but about his friend, who has a chapter devoted to this particular episode, which we really don't know whether it's true or not, but it's kind of interesting. In any event, along about November of 1864, why he asked to be reassigned for health reasons, and so he left the ship, and they appointed this Captain John Crosby to be the captain of the Harvest Moon. And John Crosby is an interesting person too, because he was also the deck on the Housatonic when the Hundley came by and sank it. And he was a fellow that apparently saw the Hundley and gave the command to part the anchor so they get away. Obviously, they never did get away. After the Housatonic sank, shortly thereafter, he was appointed to replace Warren as captain of the Harvest Moon. Later on in life, he tried to get the Navy pension, to increase his pension for health reasons, medical reasons. And he claimed that he was actually blown up and sunk on two ships, both the Housatonic and the Harvest Moon. But the pension board really didn't quite agree. And however, a couple of months before he passed away, through an act of Congress, they did raise his pension to $25 a month. But one of the unfortunate things is I've never been able to find any pictures of either of those people, Warren or Crosby. But the list on the left there is, of course, the officers that served under their command on board the Harvest Moon. There are a couple of names that are kind of interesting on there. One of them is this guy by the name of George Geer, who was the acting second assistant engineer. And my great-grandfather, when he served on board the Harvest Moon, he was a third assistant engineer. And he replaced this George Geer. Now, George Geer is interesting because he was on the Monitor when it sank, and one of the survivors of the Monitor. And so the Harvest Moon had some interesting people, both from the Monitor and the Housatonic. And as a matter of fact, they had another fellow that served on the Housatonic, what was his name? Cornthwaite, Louis Cornthwaite. He was an ensign on the Harvest Moon. Now, every quarter, the ship would issue a roster. Now, one of the things about the Harvest Moon is that it only was in service for about 2 years. And so the log books that we have, that are on file down in Washington, in the archives, there are only 2 log books, and it was possible to actually go day by day, record information from the log books. And the ship roster it was relatively easy to follow that. And right from the beginning, they would give a number to each person as they signed on. And as far as we can see, why they had around 160 people, different sailors, not at the same time, 160 that had served on the Harvest Moon. Usually they had anywhere between maybe 60, 65 sailors. You probably can't see too well here, but one of the columns, this end column here, which is complexion, right? And they list these different complexions. Most of them are like light, fair, dark, ruddy, mulatto, yellow, kind of interesting. And they have their ages listed. They have different categories of sailors too. The lowest level would be landsmen, which would be relatively no experience. And on the ship's final port of call, which was in Georgetown, before it after the Georgetown surrendered to the north, they took on about a dozen landsmen, but these were all ex-slaves, but they actually signed on as crewmen on the Harvest Moon, and their names are on here. One of the officers on the Harvest Moon was this, their surgeon, Sumner Dean. And a couple of things interesting about him. He was assigned right when the ship was commissioned in Boston, and he was from Massachusetts. And he served on the ship until the ship actually was sunk by the rebels in Georgetown. And about 60 of his letters to his wife survive. And actually, I have these posted on our website, and they're fascinating. Now, he, of course, was being kind of like running the surgeon there. He was somewhat independent of the captain. He didn't really work the ship. He had his own section there. And so some of his um, thoughts about Captain Warren, he put into his letters, you know, and he did not care for the captain at all. He thought he was a very mean, this is Captain Warren, he thought he was mean, self-serving, and I guess he made one comment that he would do anything for you if you just get down and kiss his bullshit, you know. But his letters are quite fascinating, and they were preserved by his, I guess his great-granddaughter, who, a woman by the name of Stella Skitch, who lives in England. And we're in communication with her, and she kindly sent me copies of all the letters, and we've kept in touch. An interesting thing about Stella is that her husband, his name was Jeffrey Skitch, and he was a member of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, and he's known for his part as captain of the Titanic, or rather of the Titanic, of the Pinafore. So he's retired now, but for many years that was his job. The letters of Dean are, as I say, are posted on the Harvest Moon website, and they are kind of fascinating reading. He was always after trying to improve the crew. In one letter, he requested that his wife send him a whole case of books, you know, for the crew to read. And in subsequent letters, he mentions that nobody's reading his books. We posted this website about the Harvest Moon, and we started getting emails from people all over the country and even from overseas, people that had a relative on there or was interested. One fellow in California sent me that picture. He was of the engineering officers. He was a great-grandson of James Miller. Miller is the fellow standing on the right. And he was the ranking officer amongst the engineering crew. He was a second assistant engineer. When he sent me the picture, he said that he identified his great-grandfather. He says he's standing there. All right, he said, but I don't know who the other people are. And I said, well, the person standing next to you is my great-grandfather. And I know the names of the two officers sitting down front. Unfortunately, I don't know which is which. But we have a picture of the paymaster, and don't know too much about him. And then there's this Lusby, Cleoseph Lusby. We guess he's buried in Baltimore. Isn't that right, Walter?
I think Washington,
He's in Washington.
Oh, Lusby's in Washington?
D.C.,
He's in
yeah.
the Congressional Cemetery in Washington.
Oh, okay.
Because we found his grave.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. That's really the only picture of one of the sailors on the Harvest Moon. We do have a picture of George Gear, who I mentioned before, as having served on the Monitor. And they have a bunch of his letters down in at the Mariners Museum in Virginia. They also have a full-size mock-up of the Monitor down there. Anyway, getting back to my great-grandfather, he was born in Manlius, New York, upstate New York, not too far from Syracuse, and he came down to Philadelphia when he was about 16 years old and as an apprentice at the Levy shipyard in Philadelphia. And he enlisted when he was in his early 20s, assigned to the Harvest Moon as a third assistant engineer. This was pretty close to the end of the war, 1865. And so he wasn't in the service too long. Later on in 1865, towards the end of the year, he was discharged, went back to Philadelphia, and back to the Levy shipyard, where ultimately he was there for the rest of his life, and he ultimately became director of the shipyard, and retired when the shipyard really went out of business in the early 1900s. There's a picture of one of the guns that would have been on the Harvest Moon. It wasn't very heavily armored, as you can see. It had 4 of those little howitzers, which were relatively light, and they fired a 24-pound projectile. And then it had one even a little bit smaller and lighter, because these were designed to really be taken off the ship and used on land to support ground operations. It did have one 20-pound Parrott rifle that I don't have any proof of it, but the obvious place for it would have been on the forward deck. As I mentioned, some of the primary purposes of the ship was to transport the Admiral and to do the blockading. It did support Army landings at Bull's Bay. It did fire its cannons, but rarely did it fire it except for practice. One interesting circumstance was when General Sherman was approaching the ocean, the Atlantic. He was ready to take Savannah, and he actually wanted to take Savannah and capture the Confederate troops that were in the city there. But he held a strategy meeting on board the Harvest Moon with Admiral Dahlgren to talk about how the Navy can support their operations. And while he was on the ship visiting the Admiral, he had instructed his officers to stand by, don't do anything, wait till I get back, and then we'll talk about how we're going to take Savannah. The problem was that the Harvest Moon, when he's ready to go back, the Harvest Moon ran aground, got stuck on the mud. And they had to wait till the next morning to get it off the mud. They tried, the general tried to get back using small boats, rowboats, and so on. But it was delayed so long that it allowed the Confederates to abandon Savannah. And of course, the Federal troops didn't do anything because their last order from the general was, don't do anything, So Sherman was very upset about that because he wanted to really capture that army. In any event, it was getting near the end of the war, and the Admiral Dahlgren wanted to go down to Georgetown, South Carolina, to which Georgetown actually surrendered. They sent a message to the Admiral saying that, look, we surrender. So the Admiral wanted to go down there and check out the circumstances, and they particularly had a very powerful fort down there called Fort White that he wanted to see. Oops, wrong button. So Georgetown is about halfway between Myrtle Beach and Charleston. And as shown on the map on the right there, on the left there is the what they call Wynyard Bay, which is the bay leading into Georgetown. Georgetown would be up on the left-hand corner, just out of top of the picture there. And the Atlantic Ocean is to the right. Right in the middle there, in this area, is where the Harvest Moon sank. Now what happened was the Harvest Moon, in company with several other ships, came into Georgetown, and on the way in there, it anchored just about where it ultimately sank, and the Admiral went on shore to the left to visit this Fort White there, which had been abandoned by the rebels. He then went into town, and the mayor of the town formally surrendered to him, and the Admiral decided to leave. And so the next day they left, went down the channel, and right at that point there, they ran onto a torpedo. Those torpedoes generally consisted of a barrel with maybe about 100 pounds of gunpowder in it. And supposedly that particular mine that sunk the Harvest Moon was made by a fellow by the name of Daggett, Captain Daggett. And the city of Georgetown, they kind of make a big deal about this Captain Daggett there, who made the mine that sank the Harvest Moon. My great-grandfather, of course, was on the ship at that time, and this is a picture of the letter in which he tells briefly about the sinking of it. It was written in pencil on the back of the letter, and basically he says that we sank in 10 seconds, and that he found this letter floating around in the boat. And of course, like everything else, we're blown to the devil by the devilish engines of destruction. Now, one person was killed. It was the wardroom steward, who happened to be down in the hold at the time and apparently drowned. The ship actually sank in relatively shallow water. It says 2.5 fathoms, which is about 15 feet of water. So several of the decks were above the water, and one of the other ships came by, and everybody transferred to it. Since it was pretty close to the end of the war, it was decided not to try and raise it. But what they did is they pretty much stripped it of everything that they could. They took the engine out. We have lists written by one of the officers of everything that was removed from it and shipped back to Philadelphia. The engine, furniture, and just about everything. And then over the years, today is really, it sank on March 1st of 1865. So today, March 1st is the 151st anniversary of its sinking. And the ship, after about a week or two of stripping it, was abandoned. And over the years, they changed the channel and it silted up. And so right now the ship is under maybe 5 feet of mud, except for the smokestack. And if you go down to Georgetown, go out in the bay there, Winyah Bay, why, you can see its smokestack. And it is kind of quite an attraction. Walt, Wes, and myself were down there, I guess back in the 90s, wasn't it? And we wanted to get out there, and we asked around at the yacht club, and they said, well, go see so-and-so that he'll take you out there in his boat. So we did there, and this elderly gentleman, you know, very kindly took us out in his boat out there, and apparently he lived in the area all his life. So he was telling us how he used to climb down into the smokestack and use it as a blind when he hunted ducks and stuff. And he also said that it's custom to throw a quarter down the smokestack. So for 150 some odd years, people have been throwing quarters down the smokestack. So there might be some valuable stuff down there. And this fellow also told us that, well, you know, if they get down into the Admiral's stateroom, he had a model of his Dahlgren gun made of gold. And he said, that's there, you know. Well, I don't think so. Back in the 60s, why, there was, well, a fellow was trying to raise money to excavate it. And nothing really came of it. Recently, the Navy commissioned a study by the University of South Carolina to do an analysis of the wreck itself. As I say, it's under about 5 feet of mud. And we've been down to speaking to the people at the University of South Carolina, and we have their records of their hydrographic studies. They use sonar, and they use the magnetometer, and they use probing. And basically determined that the ship is relatively intact under the mud there, fairly well preserved by the mud. But perhaps they also think that most of the damage they found, because they did find scattered pieces, would have been due to during the time that they were stripping it, you know, not caring about ripping doors off. But for a long time, that ship must have been pretty much out of the water there. There's an attraction right there in the harbor. And I have often thought that somebody must have taken a picture of that. I've never found a picture of the ship above the water. And I also would expect that people would go on the boat and maybe take a door off, you know, to put on their outhouse or something like that. But once again, never found any relic there. Back in the 60s, when they were looking to perhaps raise it, they did have some divers go down and dig through the mud, and apparently came up with a couple of hatch covers and a couple of chocks and maybe a couple of other metal parts that they gave to the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce. But in checking with the people down there now, nobody knows where this stuff is at all. But the smokestack is still out there. And when we were out there with this fellow, looking at the smokestack kind of tied up to it, he hands me a hammer. He says, pick a souvenir. Well, my first thought is, that's sacrilegious. You don't want to, this is a monument, you know, you don't want to hit it with a hammer, but the second thought, you know, it was just going to rust away. So I whacked it in a little piece of the smokestack on the Harvest Moon. Wrought iron, very nicely made. Any event, what with all of this information that we've been gathering for 20 20 years or so. I did get enough information to allow me to make some drawings, and I did make a model of it. The model itself is about 4 feet long. Originally, we made it to be radio controlled and actually be an operating model. And however, we found that when we were sailing it, it was very unstable. It would tend to either lean to the left or lean to the right. And I could never quite figure out what to do to give it that stability. The problem is that the superstructure is perhaps too heavy. And if I'd made the superstructure up there a lot lighter, it might have been a lot more stable. But it sailed nicely. It was fun to watch the paddle wheels go around. And to correct the stability, it wouldn't be a matter of putting just more weight in the bottom of it, because that would change the water line, which we couldn't do. In any event, I finally decided, well, look, it makes a nice model. And talking to people down in Georgetown, they were just putting together a very nice nautical museum down there. And we offered to give them the model, and they were very pleased to receive it. And so they had kind of an opening session down there one day that we were down to where they displayed the model. So you gotta get to Georgetown just to visit their maritime museum, and you'll see our model there. At the end, there's another picture of the Harvest Moon when Betty and I got married. On our wedding cake, we had a little model of the Harvest Moon. We cut the cake with a sword. And my sister made that painting for us. We have to figure out someday what the flags say. Anyway, so we've been working on this for 20 odd years, and we're still getting new information, as shown by those tickets that just showed up. And one of these days, we're going to find that oil painting. Anyway. Well, thank you. You have any questions? Or we have lots of information, and I often get requests from people that are looking into the Harvest Moon or writing books about other aspects where the Harvest Moon has perhaps played a minor part. And it's been very interesting and in some ways challenging. Plus we got to see a lot of maritime museums and shipyards. Well, thank you all.